I'll just introduce the panel real quickly, starting from my left. Your right is Clay Nestler, who is the Vice President of Global Energy and Sustainability at Johnson Controls. Plays in automotive and buildings and batteries. Clay is responsible for the energy and sustainability strategy, policy, and innovation at Johnson Controls. Next to him is Mark Vachon, who is Vice President for Ecomagination, which I think everybody knows is General Electric's iconic sustainable business strategy. To his left is Amit Niesenbaum, who is Vice President for Strategic Alliances at Better Place, LLC. Perhaps less known than GE and Johnson Controls, but a well-storied startup based in California and Israel, looking at a whole new business model for mobility, and we'll hear more about that. And not here yet, stuck in traffic, perhaps we'll get here in the next 45 minutes, perhaps not, we'll all be surprised, is our good friend Dave Bartlett, who's with IBM and leads their Smarter Buildings initiative. So we have, we'll bring up, sort of tee this up here. And are we going to see, am I going to see things down here, or I guess, no? On the monitor? That's all right, I'll work with it. So over the last really 10 or 20 years, I've been watching this convergence of two things that have been going on that seems to most people, probably outside this room, that they should be of a piece, but they really have been pretty separate. Which one is sustainable business, which is about the policies and strategies and practices of companies trying to align environmental responsibility and environmental into their operations in a way that aligns with core business strategy and new business opportunities. And the other is clean tech, which is about the new technologies, new companies, and whole new business models for energy, transportation, materials, water, and of course energy. And over time, as I said, those really have been distinct worlds, not really intertwined much, except in the last few years, they have become more of a Venn diagram, and it's that intersection of sustainable business and clean technology that is a really interesting place. It's about business innovation, and it's also about market uptake of clean technologies by mainstream corporate world and by society at large, and these things getting to scale, energy, electric vehicles, and so on. And so this intersection of innovation is really pretty interesting. And one particular convergence is that we've been looking at is about this intersection of energy technologies with information technologies, building technologies, and vehicle technologies, and how they're starting to come together and create definitely, more than the sum of their parts, but also not just new technologies, but in some cases whole new businesses and industries and whole new opportunities for innovation inside companies. So you see, and I won't, as these unfold, the various sub-technologies involved with all of these things, and you know about many or most or all of these things taking place individually, but it's really how they come together, the various components, and start to intersect that is sort of the interesting place of convergence. So we call it Verge. This is a term coined at GreenBiz Group in my company. And to talk about this convergence, in June we held 3 high-level roundtables in Shanghai, London, and San Francisco. IBM was a sponsor, PwC, SAP, Eaton, Autodesk, and a terrific assembly of companies that came together in those 3 places to have that conversation. Was elevated on the web. You can go and look at some of the conversation starters that we had and the pieces, the conversation that unfolded over those 3 events in 36 hours on 3 continents. We're going to be next year taking that to a step change larger in terms of both the number of places we'll be going around the world, but also the scale of those events in each place. So we've seen convergences before. We've seen over the past 20 years or so the convergence of computers, telephones, media, and commerce. We all carry it around now in some form in our pockets and purses, a smartphone or some tablet or some other device. But that convergence relative to what we're talking about here with energy, information, buildings, and vehicles is very different, because we're talking about, with those significant technologies, These extremely capital intensive, very long product life cycles, and very, very long long development cycles, but very long product life cycles. We're talking about buildings or vehicles or energy facilities. So just a snapshot of each in energy technology. And again, I know you're familiar with most of this. They're becoming decentralized and cleaner, but that makes them better able to be managed and stored, and allowing a two-way conversation through embedding intelligence and all of this with customers and the grid, and among customers, and among grids, and among the various components within the grid. In information technology, everything is getting smarter: smarter buildings, smarter vehicles. And this vast new Internet of Things that's where everything has an IP address and everything can be monitored and controlled and ultimately optimized. In buildings, the incredible data streams coming out of buildings, where you've and Dave or perhaps Clay can talk about just the amount of data points that happen in every hour in a smart building, and what gets to happen when you can take a look at those, and the rich data streams that enable you to create a number of products and services around that ultimately enhance and optimize the building's comfort and productivity. And then vehicles, which are, as they get smarter, are able to connect with other vehicles and connect the driver to everything that's around him or her, and being able to do such things as platooning vehicles, allowing them to travel in close range at high speed, optimizing efficiency, and not to mention everybody's time and safety. And then finally, that's about the products and services that we get to build in all this, but this also fundamentally can transform how businesses operate. Again, think about how the IT revolution has done that. So if you're in buildings or facilities or IT or logistics or supply chain or procurement or fleets, energy, R&D, or of course sustainability, you will increasingly be impacted by this convergence of technologies, and it will have fundamental impacts on, we believe, in terms of how companies operate, and perhaps over time how we all live, travel, shop, and play. So that's in 4 minutes and 35 seconds what I usually spend about an hour talking about. But I'm going to just really wanted to sort of talk about what we're talking about when we talk about Verge. I'd love to get each of your thoughts about how this is manifesting within Johnson Controls, GE, and Better Place in terms of, is this convergence something that you actually talk about, even if you don't necessarily use the V word? What does this look like at JCI?
Okay. Thanks, Joel. Thanks to Andrew for inviting us to participate at this great forum. I've been in this industry about 30 years at Johnson Controls, so we've been talking about convergence a long time. When I first started in the early 80s, the majority of engineers, in fact employees at Johnson Controls, were mechanical engineers. And I was one of them. An engineer is a great thing to have been. And we used to have these contests. Mark probably remembers contests like this, where it was the electrical engineers versus the mechanical engineers. And buildings, most of the buildings in New York at that time, in fact, all of them were controlled pneumatically, believe it or not. There were air compressors, and you would hear them hissing every once in a while. When you'd adjust the set point, it would hiss a little bit more. So there was this thing called the microprocessor that was invented, and we were building our first controls to control buildings with microprocessors. And remember the old contest between the horse and the steam locomotive, right? Anybody remember who won? Yeah, well, in this case, the microprocessor won, which was, I think, a really good thing. So fast forward 30 years, there are little round pieces of sheet metal up in the ceiling here, and on that sheet metal is a microprocessor that is 4 times the memory of the original IBM PC and 10 times the communications bandwidth. Every second is sending data to a system somewhere, stored and communicated over the internet, okay? So this convergence started a really, really long time ago. Now, what's interesting is I think it's sort of like the automobile in that automobiles today have 40 to 60 or 70 microprocessors, but you don't know where they are. My mother, who's about 82 years old, can drive her car just fine. She has no idea that when she's turning the wheel and pushing on the gas that she's actually sending bits to a microprocessor that's controlling it. If I put 10W40 oil in my car, I get a warning light that says, no, 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 it should have been 0W30. They're so sophisticated today, and that's what's really driving a lot of the fuel efficiency. Now, the marketplace is recognizing this capability, even though certainly in the area of efficiency, everything is transparent. We do a survey every year. It's our 5th year of individuals in buildings that make investments in energy efficiency and clean energy technologies. 4,000 people around the world. And it's very interesting. In fact, I want to just pile on to the first panel. We found 2 best practices that organizations hold that have the biggest impact in their investment in energy efficiency. The first is setting goals. The whole first panel was setting goals. In fact, 76% of those organizations around the world set a goal, either internal or external, around energy or carbon. In fact, 27 of them set public carbon goals. If you set a goal, you're over twice as likely to invest more in energy efficiency, in fact, twice as much. The most interesting one is how often you analyze data. Lots and lots of people collect data, but they don't look at it. They don't do anything with it. And those organizations, there's only 15% of them that actually analyze the data more frequently than weekly, actually invest twice as much in efficiency as well. We asked the question, what technology do you expect to have the greatest increase in adoption over the next 10 years? What do you think it was? Solar? Electric vehicles? Unfortunately not, for at least half our business. It was lighting, which I get, right? LED, organic LED, you can plot that. The other one is smart building and smart grid technologies. That's the technology people expect to deploy. So, and I think that's being driven just based on the recognition that information, energy, buildings, convergence is very, very important. And so we're starting to get some very, very strong market signals, which I think will drive that as well.
So how does this affect how you think about the different businesses you're in? You're in batteries, you're in automotive systems, you're in building optimization. Do you see actual convergence among those more than you did? Or?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for years, our battery business and our building controls business were 2 completely separate businesses united by a common, logo. And it's only recently that those batteries are now lithium-ion or advanced lead technologies. And those batteries go in cars, which get plugged into a charging station. And those charging stations are in our parking lots, and they're connected to our energy management system. And when we are limiting the demand, either taking in more solar or making ice or cooling the building or enabling or disabling the charging stations, we see that convergence absolutely coming together. And it's unavoidable now that electric vehicles and charging will be dynamic elements in the overall optimization of building controls. I mean, it's very interesting. People talk about when do we get storage and when do we get to store the wind energy at night and things such as that. A corporate campus with a large parking lot filled with charging stations is an enormous resource that can be used to store that energy and can actually provide grid regulation services as well. So that's over time, as there's adoption, that'll be a tremendous opportunity, I think, for most building owners.
Well, there's a lot to peel back on that, but let's move on to Mark. We're showing GE. Ecomagination is a platform for innovation at GE that supports the sustainability goals in companies, your customers' challenges and needs, your customers being utilities and airlines and hospitals and a whole range of larger institutional customers. How do you see a convergence taking place among the technologies? What does it look like?
Yeah, well, thank you, Joel. I think you're right on the target. And again, thanks for the invite. Glad to be here. V might stand for Vishan, but I'm learning that V for Verge is kind of what I do. I didn't call it that. But if I could step back and describe this made-up word called ecomagination and then maybe relate it to this concept of Verge, that might help the audience. Ecomagination was started 6 years ago with this sort of signal that we were getting about climate change. And the chairman, I thought, did a very intelligent thing. He brought together smart minds at our Global Research Center, created 2 teams, the red and the blue team. And the red team said, I got to argue for climate change.
This wasn't political at the time, no?
It wasn't at all.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Well, if you knew our global research scientists, that would, the blue team was supposed to argue against it. Jeff was the referee, and the red team won. The data was clear for us. So off we went and created Ecomagination. With this sort of direction, and here's where the connection to Verge comes in, we have a very important global signal. GE's been around for 130 years. We helped build the global infrastructure over the last 130 years. But it's very, very clear we need to participate in building the new 100-year infrastructure in a very, very different way. Natural resource productivity will be an incredibly important signal in doing that. And Ecomagination needs to take the innovation power that we've had and develop to solve that problem, to deliver both the economics and the environmental performance that the world is demanding. So if I reflect on Verge, and as I understand it, creating the expectation is sort of the starting point. I think we had a very helpful dynamic here, and that is a CEO who gets it. He created the expectation that the organization is going to build on solving one of the world's largest problems, natural resource productivity broadly, and that through innovation, we're going to help solve our customers' challenges. And so expectation well set, that works very well in our culture. The CEO says we're going in this direction. That didn't spur investment, so he didn't say good luck with that. He said over the last 5 years, I'm going to dedicate $5 billion of R&D to do it. And he said over the next 5 years, we're going to double that. And so we do have the luxury of the resources to make sure that all our businesses are incorporating that signal and innovating to be responsive to that. And I think in that process, we're finding whole new sources of innovation. To be honest, the old task of delivering strictly economics wasn't as hard. Now when you have to, very early in the process, hopefully, incorporate the design signal of environmental effectivity, if you will, natural resource productivity, it can be challenging. But it is changing the fabric of how we think, the value proposition we have to offer. And I would say early signs are it's creating different DNA for the company. It's working in terms of what our investors are getting out of it, the portfolio of Ecomagination products and services. And I say that specifically because I think Verge gets out of the product-based world. I'm sure we'll talk more about that. Is growing at well over 2x the rest of the portfolio.
So how hard, I mean, the vision, we get the vision and we get that Jeff Immelt and via Ecomagination holds that image. But how hard is this to do within a company? Because one of the things that I've heard from a number of companies that we've talked with about this, they say, yeah, Verge, we get it. Convergence is important. We want to be there. And I say, well, do you have any strategy for doing this? He says, no, we're stovepiped. We're these little businesses, and they're not talking to one another. And that's a big barrier. Is that, what does that look like at GE, and how do you overcome that?
It is a challenge, because if you think about particularly very deep product technology businesses, they can begin to be quite vertical in their orientation. Verge says, and frankly the way we think about Ecomagination is turn that value horizontally. And that's what we've done. If you really think about it, my role is to turn the company horizontal. So for example, I lead the executive council, one more job I don't get paid for, to coordinate what would have been an isolated product go-to-market strategy. We've got phenomenal battery technologies. We've got phenomenal charging stations. We've got smart grid capability. We've got the largest fleet leasing business out there. And they all add great value. They've been growing tremendously. But just imagine we turn that ecosystem horizontal on behalf of customers who really don't want to be served independently. They want a solution, an integrated, how do I make this city of San Diego an electric vehicle city? How do I adopt electric vehicles in China? How do I work with Better Place to institute that technology? So I do think there's a structural component to it. I also think it's important to articulate that this isn't an either or. This is an and. We'll never lose our deep technology, because that's the day of death. But this magic around making that technology accessible, adoptable, will accelerate just that adoption. So I think those are some of the techniques that we've been using.
So scaling adoption is the great challenge of Better Place. Amit, why don't you give us, I'm not sure everybody knows what Better Place is and the vision that Shai Agassi brought to the world and that you're now executing on?
Well, we're getting into dangerous water here because I can speak about that forever. So I'll try to be succinct, but before that, I'll say thank you for hosting us. And Joel, I think that this panel actually speaks to the fact that before touching on the verge that you're talking about, there's another kind of verge, which is the verge between, or convergence between companies as esteemed and big as GE and Johnson Control, etc., and new companies like us. And I think that's exciting. And maybe in a second I'll talk also about a little bit of reference point from my past about other convergence plays that I took part in and how this is unique, including from this perspective. But before that, in a very very succinct nutshell, Better Place is deploying infrastructure and providing services to end customer, to drivers, in order to make EVs commercially viable and enjoyable a product for the mass market. And I think that's a very important qualification to make. We see the future being massively, I can say, dominated by EVs. And our vision and our mission statement is to make that happen. And we're doing that basically by overcoming the two hurdles that today a customer sees in front of him or herself to that adoption. I think that everybody, I will assert that everybody, if they could, will drive an EV. Why not? It's fun, it's quiet, it's clean, it says something about your status, etc. However, there are two barriers. The two barriers are affordability and range anxiety. And we're there in order to solve those two barriers by separating the battery from the vehicle, both from the physical perspective as well as from the ownership perspective. And once one does that, a customer can get a vehicle which is at par or even more cost-effective than the ICE vehicle, the internal combustion engine vehicle, at the upfront cost, less than $25,000 for a sedan. And at the same time can drive wherever he or she wants, and if you just so happen you want to drive more than 100 miles, which is more or less the capacity of a battery that you can put in a sedan, you get into a battery switch station, which is part of our infrastructure, take out the almost depleted battery, put in a fresh one, and you don't do it manually, you're doing it in a battery switch station, which is cool and new and technology advanced. In less than 3 minutes, off you go. So that's basically what we're doing. If we have a minute or two more, I do want to talk a little bit about the convergence and a little bit how does it relate to.
Well, just to clarify, so you've taken sort of the cell phone model
Absolutely.
for electric vehicles. So we don't buy these, even though these the smartphone of some costs retails $500 or $600. You pay a lot less, maybe nothing at all.
Right.
And you get into a subscription-based relationship with the, is that what's going on here, where you now all of a sudden are getting this thing at little or nothing, no cost, and then you have, is it based on per mileage or per battery swap or per some basis?
Yeah, the analogy for the business in the business models domain is exactly like you said, the same way like in the cellular, the mobile industry, where you'll get into, let's say, an AT&T store, buy a cell phone, and again, it could be cheap, it could be for free, that's the nuances, and at the same time you subscribe for 2 minutes. In this case, you'll buy an electric vehicle, which will be cost effective, even free at some circumstances maybe, but for sure cost effective, and you will subscribe to miles. And the miles that you pay for is basically what's underneath that is the access to the right to access the infrastructure that we have, the right to use a battery at any given time, because the batteries are our batteries. We own them in order that you won't carry that on your personal balance sheet, and all of the other services that we provide, such as customer service, roadside assistance, etc.
So your business is Better Place is inherently about convergence, at least certainly obviously with vehicles, information, and energy, and buildings, to the extent that you're building a network of battery swapping stations around. Is that the convergence you were talking about, or is there another aspect?
Well, it is the convergence that we see in front of us, and actually if you go deeper into our model, you will see that we're converging other industries as well, the retail industry. So we have battery switch stations that substitute for the gas stations. Gas station owners are not in the business of selling gas. You'll be surprised. They're in the business of selling the gum and the pack of cigarettes that you'll buy when you're
because the margins on food are much higher than the margins on gas.
Of course.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden you find out that you're touching that industry as well. And how do you work with that part of the ecosystem in order to create a win-win-win? So yeah, that's the verge that we're seeing in front of us.
So fundamentally, what all three of you are talking about, and it manifests, very clearly within Better Place, requires some kinds of standards and norms around how these things connect. Clay, you must bump up against this all the time in the energy and the vehicle market. And I know all of you do, but what is the role of as one of the many enablers that are in this space, what are the role of standards, and where's that going to come from?
Yeah, one of the things I think that's different today than it was certainly different 20, 30 years ago when systems became smart based on microprocessors and communications is I think the industry is trying to get ahead in the standards area. In the buildings market in particular, everybody developed their own, everybody was vertically integrated. You bought a microprocessor, you wrote your own operating system, you wrote your own communications protocol, you developed all your own standards, and then we spent the next 20 to 25 years trying to integrate all these disparate systems together. And there was always a dream of plug and play, and it actually ended up being more plug and pray. And it still is kind of the curse of our industry to this date. What we're seeing today is that organizations are getting together to define those standards. This is a lesson we learned from the information technology industry and communications. There's a group called EISA, the Energy Information Standards Alliance, that's very quickly, very broadly across industrial, commercial, and residential, trying to define the standards for the customer use. It involves things like the meters, the equipment, energy storage, communications, distributed generation like solar, and really trying to define those standards so that they don't become a barrier to adoption. We certainly see in the automotive side of the world where every manufacturer wants something a little bit different with a little different interface. I mean, it's taken a long time to just define the standard for the plug that you would plug into the charging station. So I'm sure both of you can really relate to that. It's going to take a lot more than the standardization of a plug to get scale and volume and the types of interchangeability that Amit was talking about. So it's a critical enabler.
Well, let me put a finer point on it, because if you think about the two revolutions we've gone through in the last couple, quarter century, internet and mobile telephony, they're very, very different. One of them became a standard where there's IP and TCP, IP, and HTML, and all these geeky acronyms for everything that we now do seamlessly on all the various things that we have. And the other is balkanized. We've got GSM and CDMA and TDMA and ASAP and all this stuff that doesn't talk to one another, and you can't use phones are built for different systems. That's sounds like it's a real problem for certainly for your company, Amit, and probably for a lot of your customers, Mark. What is that is this going to come from government? Is this going to come from a voluntary consortium of some sort? How do you see this unfolding, Mark?
Well, yeah, I think it is a partnership, and I think it is essential. I think the old world where if you think you can carve out a market with proprietary protection in your software, I mean, it's a really dinosaur thought process, which fundamentally retards the growth of industries. And so we've got to get folks who may not be thinking that way in private industry thinking that way. And ultimately, yes, government will have to step in. I think it's always best when that's done in a partnership, because that may not come out with the optimum solution when any one party sort of summarily decides on that. But I do think it's a very important equation to faster adoption, particularly in these new technologies that we're talking about.
Are those partnerships happening? Are they happening,
in large
happening
part,
fast enough?
I think, as Clay said, no. No. Private industry has a much faster clock speed than others.
Amit, are they happening for you fast enough? Are you getting what you need?
Yeah, surprisingly enough, one aspect of that is happening with GE, where we're integrating or making sure that their watt stations are interoperable with our back-end systems, and I think it's for the benefit of everybody. I wouldn't hold my breath for waiting for governments to take the lead on that. I think that governments and more probably more than that, standardization bodies will pick on the signals and on the efforts of some companies that will come together in order to create a direction as related to standardization with anything.
Well, again, we talk about governments, and I think that everyone immediately goes to Washington, but this is clearly a global issue we're talking about and a global opportunity, where do you all see this convergence happening? Or where will it really take root first? Will it be in the developed countries? Will it be in China and India? And I'm sure that we're talking about so many things that the answer is going to be it depends on the technology. But talk a little bit, Clay, about what you see unfolding and where.
If you drill a hole through the earth from Washington and you climb through the other end, that might be closer to where we'll see some of the innovation.
Okay, Mr. Geography, where is that?
I remember 10, 15 years ago, my first trip to Singapore. And we were driving around, and I was pleasantly surprised to see all the signs in English and cars with steering wheels. And I remember pulling into a parking garage, and there was a sign that said how many parking spots there were, and little lights telling me exactly where to go, and little lights above the parking spots that said exactly where you should park. And there was a little indicator of when the next spot would be available. And I was just astounded. And what I found time and time again is that sometimes it is small areas that have, for whatever reason, whether it's their political system or whatever, they just make a commitment. And I remember when there was a fight to the death between Singapore and Malaysia as to who was going to be the kind of communication super corridor in the region. And they competed, and Singapore said, we're going to put, high-speed bandwidth to every person in the entire city. And then Malaysia countered with something else, and they basically challenged each other to deploy technology. That was 15 years ago. So I think in many cases, the innovation may come in Israel, it may come in Denmark, it may come in areas, right, where...
Countries where Better Places is operating.
Exactly. So those might really set the model, I think, and then be adapted. I think we've seen that time and time again, where you need some really good examples, and then it kind of spreads from there.
Is that true on buildings as well? I don't want to fixate entirely on vehicles, but you're obviously, buildings is a core of your market. With the building booms going on in China, India, and elsewhere, are those technologies going to be unfolding more sophisticatedly there than here?
Well, there's a huge emphasis in the construction of new buildings in China and India. And here the focus is primarily, and in Europe, in the retrofitting of existing buildings. So I do think that will drive greater adoption and greater use of technology. There'll also be more innovative designs for the buildings themselves. So this may very well be the case where we could look outside of the U.S. for some of at least the ideas. This is an awful good place to take an idea, innovate it, bring it to scale, and then capitalize on it.
Mark, what's your company's global view?
Yeah, I'd separate it and try not to name names. I would separate idea generation from delivery and impact. I just got back from Palo Alto, which I'm just convinced I need to go move to immediately. Especially as summer comes, or fall, or winter.
They might.
If you think about this innovation soup of academics, engineering, VCs, you can't get a coffee on the streets of Palo Alto without having ideas and innovation just be thrown at you. I'm reading this book.
And business plans, too.
And business plans. Yeah. I'm reading this book by Richard Florida called Who's Your City? And he makes the argument on the other end of the continuum from Friedman, who says the world is flat and location is irrelevant, that actually location and place is incredibly important, particularly for innovation. And I'm a believer in that one. I really am. I think both are true. But in terms of the idea generation part, I think look to places that have that innovation soup, and you'll find a disproportionate idea generation output there. So where does that take place? Look, Palo Alto is not going to be a consumer of magnitude of these kind of scale technologies. So where are you going to see that? I would look to large companies who integrate with other companies well. I would look for very large, I'll call it state consumers, whether those are countries, municipalities, cities. I think the C40 is a nice little microcosm around adoption and acceleration. So I would, rather than sort of politicizing the actual location or companies, think about it in those two chunks.
But sticking to place-based, I mean, this is I think that cities are probably the place where this kind of convergence is going to take place, or campuses, college, corporate, whatever. Um, do you see? Could you name? Is it Singapore? Is it New York City? Is it? Where do you see this really?
I'll give you a hint.
To...
We're locating our software COE in Palo Alto, for example, one of them. We have 5 different global research centers in Beijing, in Munich. The latest one is in Rio. In upstate New York is the beginning. So I think it's very regional, and I think it's very important to keep that regional, because what developments are appropriate in Rio, biomass, biofuels, very different than what's required in Beijing, for example.
Well,
I would add one sort of screen on where you want to look geographically is look for clarity of governmental policy in this space. And where there is, whether or not you agree with it or not, is fundamentally irrelevant. But give me a landscape that I can see and digest, and I can innovate around that. Give me ambiguity and give me a plane ticket out of there.
But Palo Alto is, you know, a city in San Mateo County, or I think Santa Clara County, and in the state. I mean, it's not the clarity of policy in California.
Yeah, again, that's why I'd separate idea generation, high marks for Palo Alto.
Okay, I see. But not the place-based where that's
look for where
unfold.
the real economics and adoption are going to happen. That's a separate set of attributes.
Okay, I'm getting range anxiety because I'm getting a sign saying we're running out of time. But I want to see if we have any questions that we want to take real quickly, because we could go on and on. Amit could go on and on for an hour. Do we want to?
And it would be fascinating.
Burning.
Really?
No. All right. Well, what is, and I know your answer, Amit, is going to be, but what is the killer app of convergence? What is the thing that people are going to say? You know, if you, arguably an iPhone might have been a killer app of convergence among those technologies talked about earlier. People got it, and then Android and iPads, and it continues to unfold. Is it going to be electric vehicles? Is it going to be incredible buildings? Is it going to be the smart home?
I will surprise you. It's not the electric vehicle. The electric vehicle is a private case, which is very, very important of storage. I think that storage and storage uses are the killer apps, or the killer app class that you're looking for. It's not there yet from the economics perspective.
So by storage, you mean the ability for vehicles and buildings to store energy from the grid to deploy during times of...
The grid, from distributed generation,
sure.
The ability to combine the two in a smart way in order to provide higher value. And EVs are absolutely a private case of storage.
So consumers, or perhaps the companies that deploy these vehicles locally in better places case, that will bring people the ability to have energy that they can use or sell on an as-needed basis?
Absolutely. I think that's going to be the first wedge, or the first place where storage is going to play a significant part, because by itself, storage, mobile storage in EVs pays for itself on the economics basis. But then you can have so many other value-add services and values coming out of that storage being located at a location as a fixed storage or fixed-based storage, and layer on top of those values that the EV generates, other values, that's the first place that it's going to manifest itself.
Mark, Convergence killer app.
You know, part of my reason for being in Palo Alto is, even I'm a dinosaur 29 year in GE, they actually thought I could learn something. So I was there training on social media and its connection to those who are going to run this world in 2020. Those are called the millennials, and the connection to it. In the process, I was bombarded by apps. New iPad 2, literally 3 pages of apps. What I've concluded is, don't get too hung up on the apps. Get focused on what the goal is supposed to be. And in answer to your question, I believe that we should bet on lots of apps, but oriented to where the value creation is. And in so doing, look at the inverse of value, and that is waste. If we look at energy generation distribution, it is an incredibly wasteful process. It is ridiculous. And so look to apps that sort of highlight and fix that. Second would be around water use. We haven't, as a world, talked about that enough. But any app that improves sort of efficiency and reuse, massive app capability. And then I think transportation is a big one, and we're pretty long on EVs.
Sure. Clay, you're in the battery business. Do you agree with Amit on storage?
Storage is going to be very, very important, and but I think the killer app is when we take the storage that's in vehicles or stationary and connect them to buildings. And I just think that there's a tremendous opportunity to take advantage of being able to connect all of these buildings, whether they be high-rises here in New York City or whether they be campuses or whether they be universities and school districts and even homes, and connect them together and essentially create the equivalent of megawatt power plants. We are absolutely not taking advantage of the fact that with all this computer and information technology, we should be able to dim the lights ever so slowly. We should be able to cool the building down in the morning and reduce the peaks in the afternoon. We ought to be able to decide when to charge the vehicles. In the parking lot, we talk a lot about smart charging, but what we're really talking about is not doing dumb charging. We don't want to charge the cars at 3 o'clock in the afternoon when we're facing a brownout. Smart charging is when I actually synchronize the charging with excess capacity due to wind or solar or things such as that. And I think that the technology is really becoming available to be able to manage all of these buildings collectively. And instead of building big fossil fuel, powered power plants, actually take advantage of the megawatts available by coordinated efficiency at a minute-by-minute time scale. Everybody's probably heard of the Empire State Building retrofit project, 38% energy reduction. The least known application is a tenant energy management system that's in every tenant office space that tells them how much energy they're using on a 15-minute basis, that they can track over time. They can compare their energy use with all the other tenants, and someday, I hope, allow them to opt in to demand response. So they'll cycle down their computers, they'll dim the lights in their spaces. Today, the Empire State Building can shed a couple megawatts of load in response to the need by Con Ed to reduce energy. If you're in the lobby, the lights dim a little bit, nobody even notices it. We stop using electric chillers, we use steam. Nobody even knows it's happening, but it's very, very economic valuable. Imagine doing that in every tenant space, in every building in Manhattan, and extending that across the country. That's a tremendous resource, and it has to be more cost effective than building lots of new plants. That's the killer app.
So in some regards, the killer app is the thing that we all start doing that we're not even necessarily aware of, but our lives change and the way we interact with things change, even though we're not necessarily overtly going out and buying new things. Interesting. Well, this is a conversation that could clearly go on. And it will, March 14th to 16th in Washington, D.C., when we do our first Verge conference. There, I said it. But
Shameless.
Shameless. No, we will be continuing this conversation. Some of you will be part of that. But for now, I want to thank Clay Nestler, Mark Vachon, and Amit Nissenbaum for a great conversation.